Every generation believes it stands at the edge of something unprecedented, a rupture, a collapse, a future so different that the past no longer applies. This belief is comforting. It suggests that confusion is temporary, that instability is exceptional, and that once the moment passes, clarity will return. History offers no evidence for this. Human societies have always lived inside forces they barely understood. Fire once escaped control. Agriculture once destabilized entire ecosystems. Cities once overwhelmed tribal identity. Empires once expanded beyond their ability to govern. Each transformation felt final to the people inside it. Each was survived. What we call the future has never arrived cleanly. It emerges unevenly, carried forward by systems built for older conditions. The result is tension, not because humanity is failing, but because adaptation is slower than change. Power today feels abstract, less personal, more distributed, harder to locate. That does not make it new. Power has always shifted form before it shifted function. Kings became institutions. Institutions became markets. Markets became systems. Systems now operate through code, logistics, finance, and information. The mechanisms evolve. The questions do not. Who decides? Who benefits? Who absorbs the cost? Who is protected? Who is expendable? Every era believes it is the first to face these questions at scale. Every era is wrong. What is different is visibility. In earlier centuries, consequence traveled slowly. Decisions taken at the center took generations to ripple outward. Today, cause and effect compress. A policy decision in one country can destabilize markets elsewhere within hours. A technological change can reshape behavior across continents in a decade. Acceleration creates the illusion of novelty. It feels unprecedented because it is faster, not because it is different. This distinction matters. If the moment is unprecedented, then there is no guidance.
No reference, no responsibility, except survival. If the moment is accelerated history, then patterns still apply, and agency remains. Much of modern anxiety comes from confusion between these two interpretations. Technology is often blamed. Artificial intelligence, automation, algorithms, networks. But technology does not introduce human behavior, it scales it. Fear travels faster, solidarity scales wider. Misinformation spreads instantly, so does knowledge. This is not a crisis of machines. It is a crisis of amplification. Every prior expansion of human capability produced similar fear. Writing was accused of destroying memory. Printing was accused of spreading heresy. Industrial machinery was accused of erasing dignity. Each accusation contained truth and incompleteness. The danger was never the tool alone. It was the absence of restraint during integration. Societies rarely collapse because they invent something. They destabilize because they deploy faster than they adapt. This is where the present moment truly sits, not at the edge of extinction, not at the dawn of utopia, but inside an integration gap. The systems shaping daily life, economic, technological, political, are operating at scales beyond the moral frameworks that once governed them. This creates stress. Stress produces polarization. Polarization produces paralysis. History shows this pattern repeatedly. When agriculture expanded, societies invented property law. When cities expanded, societies invented bureaucracy. When trade expanded, societies invented finance. When industry expanded, societies invented regulation. None of these solutions were immediate. None were clean. All were resisted. What we now call tradition was once adaptation under pressure. The present era is no exception. The difference is that adaptation now competes with distraction. Information abundance fragments attention.
Consensus becomes harder, not because people disagree more, but because they no longer share the same informational ground. Without shared ground, negotiation collapses into assertion. Assertion feels powerful. It is usually fragile. Power that cannot negotiate must eventually coerce. Power that must constantly coerce erodes its own legitimacy. This cycle has repeated across empires, states, corporations, and movements. It is not ideology-specific, it is structural. which leads to the real question behind what comes next. Not what will happen, but how societies respond when adaptation is delayed. History suggests 4 broad responses. Some double down on control. Some fragment into localism. Some attempt reform through institutions. Some collapse into conflict. Most experience combinations of all 4. The future is rarely chosen cleanly. It emerges from competing responses operating simultaneously. Understanding this removes the illusion of inevitability. The future is constrained, but not scripted. And that distinction preserves responsibility. History rarely errs when people lose faith. It destabilizes when systems do. Most collapses are not moral failures at first. They are coordination failures. The rules that once aligned behavior with outcomes stop working at scale. Incentives drift. Authority fragments. Legitimacy erodes quietly, long before violence or revolution appear. By the time a crisis is visible, the structure beneath it has usually been unstable for decades. This pattern repeats across civilizations. The Roman Republic did not fall because citizens stopped believing in Rome. It fell because institutions designed for a city-state could not govern an empire. Authority accumulated in emergency measures. Emergency measures became permanent. Legitimacy narrowed. Violence followed later. The late medieval world did not fracture because faith disappeared.
It fractured because economic, religious, and political authority no longer aligned. When alignment breaks, trust collapses. Reformation follows structure, not belief. Industrial societies did not erupt into unrest because people rejected progress. They erupted because labor, capital, and governance were misaligned. The system extracted faster than it protected. Regulation followed only after instability forced it. In each case, the people inside the system felt something familiar: confusion, loss of control, distrust of elites, fear of disorder. These emotions are not signs of decline, they are signals of mismatch. The modern world is experiencing a mismatch of scale. Institutions designed for slower economies now regulate global markets that move in milliseconds. Political systems built for local accountability now manage populations of hundreds of millions. Moral frameworks shaped by scarcity now operate in environments of artificial abundance. This mismatch produces stress. Stress does not distribute evenly. Those closest to power feel insulated longer. Those furthest from protection feel pressure first. This is why instability often appears as resentment before it appears as collapse. People sense that outcomes no longer reflect effort, participation, or contribution. They sense that rules apply selectively. They sense that accountability has thinned. Once this perception spreads, legitimacy weakens. Legitimacy is not belief in perfection, it is belief in process. When people believe systems are flawed but correctable, they tolerate failure. When they believe systems are rigged or unreachable, tolerance evaporates. At that point, societies do not immediately choose alternatives. They test boundaries. They disengage. They radicalize. They retreat into identity. These behaviors are often framed as cultural problems. They are structural responses. The modern obsession with polarization misunderstands its cause.
Polarization is not primarily ideological. It is positional. Groups polarize when shared institutions stop mediating conflict effectively. Without trusted mediation, every disagreement becomes existential. Compromise feels like surrender. Dialogue feels unsafe. This is not because people suddenly hate each other more. It is because systems no longer absorb disagreement. Historically, this is when narratives harden. Simpler explanations replace complex ones. Blame becomes directional. Enemies are identified. The world feels chaotic, so meaning is reintroduced through certainty. Certainty is comforting. It is also dangerous. Rigid narratives reduce anxiety in the short term. They reduce adaptability in the long term. Civilizations rarely fail because they lack intelligence. They fail because they overcommit to explanations that once worked. The present era faces a version of this risk. Economic systems reward efficiency, not resilience. Political systems reward attention, not competence. Media systems reward outrage, not understanding. Technological systems reward speed, not reflection. Each system functions rationally on its own terms. Together, they produce instability. This is why the future feels ungovernable to many. Not because governance is impossible, but because coordination across systems has weakened. When coordination weakens, authority fractures. Formal authority remains, laws, offices, institutions, but informal authority collapses. Trust dissolves. Compliance becomes transactional rather than cooperative. This distinction matters. Cooperation scales, coercion does not. The more a system relies on coercion to function, the more resources it must spend maintaining order. Eventually, maintenance consumes capacity meant for adaptation. History shows this repeatedly. Late empires grow heavy with enforcement, surveillance expands, bureaucracy thickens, innovation slows.
Meanwhile, peripheral systems, black markets, informal networks, alternative authorities flourish. This is not rebellion. It is substitution. People do not abandon systems because they want chaos. They abandon systems because systems no longer serve coordination. What comes next is shaped by whether institutions recognize this moment early or late. Early recognition allows reform. Late recognition forces rupture. Reform is slow. It requires restraint by those who benefit most from the current system. It requires redistribution of authority. It requires admitting that old successes have become liabilities. Rupture is faster. It redistributes pain indiscriminately. History suggests that societies prefer reform rhetorically, but often drift into rupture by default. The present moment is balanced between these paths, not because collapse is imminent, but because delay accumulates cost. Delay feels safe to those insulated from consequence. Delay feels unbearable to those already absorbing it. This asymmetry drives political instability more than ideology ever could. Understanding this reframes the future. The question is not whether technology, climate, or globalization will destabilize society. They already have. The question is whether coordination can be rebuilt before legitimacy erodes beyond repair. That question has no technical solution. It is institutional. It is cultural. It is moral. And it has precedent. History does not change because people agree. It changes because pressure accumulates. Consensus is often a result of transformation, not its cause. Before systems reform, they resist. Before norms shift, they fracture. Before cooperation expands, conflict clarifies boundaries. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge, but consistent across centuries. The abolition of slavery did not emerge from universal moral agreement. It emerged from economic shifts, political struggle, war, and relentless pressure applied by those denied power.
Moral clarity followed structural change, not the other way around. Labor protections did not arise because industrial leaders suddenly valued workers. They arose because strikes, unrest, and instability made exploitation unsustainable. Regulation followed disruption. Civil rights did not advance because prejudice dissolved peacefully. They advanced because segregation became incompatible with economic growth, global legitimacy, and internal stability. Pressure exposed contradiction. Authority intervened only when inaction became riskier than reform. This pattern matters for the present. Many people wait for agreement before acting. They hope polarization will soften, dialogue will return, and compromise will emerge organically. History offers little support for this expectation. Agreement rarely precedes reform. Pressure does not mean violence by default. It means cost. When maintaining the status quo becomes more expensive than changing it, systems adapt. When the cost of reform is lower than the cost of resistance, elites concede. When institutions cannot absorb tension, they reorganize. The question is not whether pressure will exist. It already does. The question is how pressure is expressed and where it concentrates. Pressure can be constructive or destructive. Constructive pressure targets systems. Destructive pressure targets identities. History distinguishes between the two clearly. When pressure is aimed at institutions, laws, incentives, structures, reform becomes possible. When pressure is redirected toward scapegoats, ethnic groups, minorities, outsiders, regression follows. Periods of instability often contain both forces simultaneously. The early 20th century produced labor reform and fascism. The post-war era produced welfare states and authoritarian regimes. The late 20th century produced globalization and ethnic conflict. The direction is never guaranteed.
What determines the outcome is not ideology alone, but institutional capacity. Institutions matter not because they are perfect, but because they channel conflict. Courts absorb disputes without bloodshed. Elections convert anger into rotation of power. Regulation transforms exploitation into negotiation. When institutions weaken, conflict seeks other outlets. The present moment reveals stress fractures in institutional capacity. Electoral legitimacy is questioned. Judicial authority is politicized. Media credibility fragments. Expertise is distrusted. These are not isolated failures. They are signs that mediation is failing. When mediation fails, conflict becomes personal. People retreat into identities because identities feel stable when systems do not. Nation, religion, ideology, culture, these offer meaning when institutions feel hollow. This retreat is not irrational. It is adaptive under uncertainty. But identity-based conflict is harder to resolve than interest-based conflict. Interests can be negotiated. Identities cannot. History warns repeatedly about this shift. The wars of religion in Europe were not about doctrine alone. They were about collapsing political authority. Doctrine became the language of conflict, not its root. Modern polarization follows a similar trajectory. Arguments appear cultural. They are structural underneath. Economic insecurity, loss of agency, erosion of trust. Culture becomes the surface where these pressures express themselves. Understanding this prevents false solutions. No amount of messaging can repair institutional decay. No amount of unity rhetoric can substitute for functional coordination. Reform requires rebuilding mediation. This is slow work. It involves restoring credibility to processes, not personalities. It requires rules that apply predictably, not selectively. It requires visible accountability for power. Historically, this is where many societies hesitate.
Because reform redistributes authority. Those who benefit from the current arrangement lose relative advantage. Even well-intentioned leaders resist changes that diminish their leverage. This resistance delays adaptation. Delay increases pressure. Pressure eventually forces change, but often under worse conditions. This is the danger of mistaking stability for health. A system can appear stable while accumulating fragility. Calm surfaces often conceal stressed foundations. The future hinges on whether adaptation occurs early enough to avoid rupture. History suggests that societies rarely choose early adaptation willingly. They choose it when alternatives narrow. This does not mean catastrophe is required, but it does mean discomfort is unavoidable. Every meaningful reform feels threatening to those accustomed to the old order. The present moment is not unique in this regard. It is following a familiar arc. What makes it dangerous is not the presence of pressure, but the absence of trust that pressure can be resolved without loss. Restoring that trust is the central challenge ahead. Not optimism, not unity, trust in mediation. When legitimacy erodes, collapse is not immediate. What follows is drift. Institutions continue to operate, but belief in them thins. Rules still exist, but compliance becomes conditional. Authority is obeyed less because it is accepted, and more because alternatives are unclear. This phase is dangerous precisely because it feels familiar. Elections still happen, courts still issue rulings, markets still function. The surface remains intact while the foundation weakens. History shows that recovery does not begin with restoration of the past. Attempts to return almost always fail. After major legitimacy crises, societies that survive do not rewind, they reconfigure. The post-Roman world did not rebuild the Roman Republic. It developed new political forms adapted to fragmented authority.
Medieval institutions emerged not from nostalgia, but necessity. After the religious wars of Europe, stability did not come from renewed unity of belief. It came from tolerance enforced by state power. The Peace of Westphalia did not resolve theology. It redefined sovereignty. After the Great Depression, industrial societies did not return to unregulated markets. They accepted permanent state involvement. Welfare systems, central banking, and labor protections became structural features, not temporary measures. Recovery follows adaptation, not restoration. This distinction matters now. Modern discourse often frames instability as moral decay or cultural loss.
These explanations are appealing because they suggest simple fixes: restore values, reassert norms, return to tradition. History suggests this approach rarely succeeds. Values matter, but they cannot substitute for function. When systems no longer coordinate behavior effectively, moral appeals become symbolic rather than corrective. People may agree in principle and still act in contradiction because incentives overwhelm belief. Rebuilding legitimacy requires redesign. Redesign is unglamorous. It involves technical rules, institutional checks, and constraints on power. It requires reducing opportunities for abuse, even when trust is low. It accepts that virtue is unreliable at scale. This is one of history's most uncomfortable lessons. Good systems assume bad behavior. They are built to withstand selfishness, error, and ambition. They do not rely on constant moral excellence. They rely on alignment. Alignment between effort and outcome, between authority and accountability, between power and restraint. When alignment exists, trust follows gradually. When alignment fails, trust collapses quickly. The difficulty is that alignment often reduces efficiency in the short term. Checks slow decisions. Oversight limits flexibility. Constraints frustrate ambition.
In periods of acceleration, these features are criticized as obstacles. History shows they are stabilizers. Societies that remove constraints to gain speed often discover too late that speed without control multiplies damage. The 20th century offers many examples. Total war economies mobilized unprecedented power and required unprecedented restraint afterward to prevent permanent militarization. Surveillance systems built for security threatened liberty once normalized. Emergency measures justified by crisis proved difficult to reverse. The lesson is not that power should not expand. It is that expansion must be paired with containment. Modern systems struggle here. Technology expands capability faster than institutions expand restraint. This creates gaps where power operates without oversight. In those gaps, legitimacy decays. Rebuilding legitimacy requires closing these gaps, not through moral consensus, but through enforceable limits. This is where many societies hesitate. Limits feel like weakness. Restraint feels like loss. But history shows the opposite. The most durable systems are those that restrain themselves. The Roman Empire lasted longer than the Republic because it centralized authority, but it collapsed when restraint vanished. The British state survived industrialization because it gradually extended political participation. Democracies endure not because they are pure, but because they adapt constraints. Adaptation is slower than collapse. This creates a psychological trap. People underestimate the time required to rebuild and overestimate the speed of failure. Panic accelerates destructive behavior. Cynicism discourages reform. History suggests a different posture. Periods after legitimacy loss are long. They involve experimentation, partial failures, and uneven recovery. There is no single turning point. There is no dramatic restoration. Instead, trust is rebuilt in fragments, through processes that work predictably.
Through accountability that is visible, through institutions that fail less often over time. This is unsatisfying to those seeking resolution, but it is how recovery actually happens. What comes next, therefore, is not clarity. It is adjustment. And adjustment depends less on ideology than on design. When societies lose confidence in the present, they search the past for certainty. This impulse is ancient. Periods of instability consistently produce idealized memories of earlier eras, times imagined as simpler, more coherent, more moral. These memories are rarely accurate. They are selective reconstructions shaped by present anxiety. Nostalgia is not about history. It is about reassurance. The past feels stable because it is complete. Its conflicts are resolved. Its uncertainties are known. The present, by contrast, is unfinished. Outcomes are unclear. Responsibility feels heavier. Nostalgia reduces that burden. By framing decline as deviation, it implies that restoration is possible. If something was once right, then it can be made right again. This belief is emotionally powerful. It is also structurally misleading. History shows that attempts to restore past arrangements almost always fail, not because the past was bad, but because conditions have changed. Economic structures evolve, demographics shift, technology alters behavior, power redistributes. Systems that once functioned well do not simply resume operation when reintroduced into new environments. Yet nostalgia remains politically effective. It offers clarity with complexity, identity with no compromise, belonging with no negotiation. During the late Roman Republic, elites appealed to ancestral virtue while consolidating emergency powers. During Europe's religious wars, factions claimed to restore true faith while dismantling political stability. In the early 20th century, nationalist movements invoked mythical pasts to justify authoritarian control.
In each case, nostalgia became a tool of mobilization. It redirected frustration away from systems and toward symbols. It replaced structural analysis with moral storytelling. It simplified blame. This is why nostalgia often precedes regression. Not because the past is evil, but because memory becomes myth. Myth compresses history into meaning. It selects heroes, erases contradiction, and assigns purpose retroactively. Myth is useful for cohesion. It is dangerous for governance. Governance requires precision. Myth requires clarity. These goals are incompatible. When myth overtakes policy, decisions prioritize symbolic victory over functional outcomes. Institutions are reshaped to affirm identity rather than manage reality. Dissent becomes heresy. Complexity becomes betrayal. History is unambiguous on this point. Societies that substitute myth for structure lose adaptability. They become brittle. Brittleness is not weakness, it is rigidity. Rigid systems appear strong until stress exceeds tolerance. When they fail, failure is sudden and destructive. The present era shows early signs of this danger. Political language increasingly references lost greatness, stolen futures, or betrayed traditions. These narratives differ in content, but share structure. They frame the problem as deviation from an imagined norm rather than misalignment with current conditions. This framing shifts focus. Instead of asking, how do we redesign systems to function under new realities? The question becomes, how do we return to who we were? History suggests this question leads nowhere productive. The past does not return. What does return are unresolved patterns. Power concentrates. Institutions lag. Trust erodes. Identity hardens. The solution is not to erase memory, but to discipline it. Healthy societies remember accurately. They acknowledge past achievement without ignoring past harm. They draw lessons without demanding replication.
They treat history as guidance, not instruction. This requires maturity. It also requires resisting the emotional pull of simplicity. In unstable periods, simplicity feels like relief. Complexity feels like surrender. But governance is irreducibly complex at scale. Any attempt to simplify it through myth creates blind spots. Blind spots accumulate cost. This is why reform movements grounded in nostalgia often overpromise and underdeliver. They mobilize energy but lack mechanisms. When results fail to appear, frustration intensifies. Authority responds with enforcement rather than redesign. The cycle tightens. History shows an alternative path. Successful renewal does not idolize the past. It extracts principles, not forms. The American constitutional system did not replicate ancient republics. It adapted their ideas to a new scale. Post-war welfare states did not recreate medieval guilds. They reinterpreted social obligation for industrial economies. These examples matter. They show that continuity does not require imitation. It requires translation. Translation acknowledges difference. It accepts loss. It creates something new that preserves function under changed conditions. The danger ahead is not forgetting history. It is misusing it. What comes next depends on whether societies can resist myth long enough to rebuild structure. That task is not inspiring. It is technical. It is slow. And it is the only path that has ever worked. Adaptation rarely announces itself. It does not arrive as a breakthrough moment or a decisive victory.
It emerges unevenly through adjustments that feel insufficient at the time and obvious only in retrospect. This is why people living through periods of reform often believe nothing is improving. History confirms this perception. When systems begin to adapt, benefits distribute slowly. Costs, however, are immediate. New rules disrupt familiar routines. Old privileges are constrained.
Expectations are revised downward before stability returns. This creates a paradox. The moment adaptation begins is often experienced as decline. Consider the decades following the Great Depression. At the time, recovery felt fragile and incomplete. Political conflict intensified. Global war followed. Only later did historians identify the period as one of institutional renewal. The same applies to post-war reconstruction in Europe and Japan. The process was painful, uneven, and contested. It involved rationing, regulation, and external oversight. Only decades later did the stability achieved appear inevitable. Adaptation is slow because it competes with inertia. Existing systems persist not because they work well, but because they work well enough to delay change. Individuals adapt faster than institutions. Informal practices emerge before formal reform. Black markets precede regulation. Mutual aid precedes policy. These informal adaptations matter. They reveal what people need before institutions recognize it. History shows that durable reform often formalizes behaviors that already exist. Labor laws followed union practice. Public education expanded after literacy became necessary. Social insurance followed informal family support networks overwhelmed by scale. Institutions lag because they require legitimacy to change. Legitimacy does not come from innovation alone, it comes from predictability. People tolerate experimentation only when basic coordination remains intact. When trust is low, reform must be incremental or it fails outright. This is why revolutions often overreach. They attempt to replace entire systems at once. The resulting vacuum invites chaos or authoritarian consolidation. History records many such outcomes. By contrast, gradual adaptation appears unsatisfying but endures. It adjusts incentives rather than identities. It modifies rules rather than rewriting meaning. It preserves continuity while changing function.
The difficulty is patience. Modern societies struggle with patience because visibility has increased. Every failure is broadcast. Every delay is criticized. Progress is measured against expectation rather than baseline. This distorts perception. Adaptation is judged as failure because it does not resolve everything immediately, but history shows that resilience is built layer by layer. Consider the expansion of civil rights. Legal victories did not end inequality. They created frameworks. Progress followed unevenly, contested at every step. Decades later, gains appear substantial. At the time, they felt incomplete. The same applies to governance reform. Transparency improves slowly. Accountability strengthens unevenly. Trust rebuilds incrementally. These processes cannot be rushed without breaking legitimacy further. Another factor shaping adaptation is generational turnover. Major reforms often succeed not because opponents are convinced, but because they are replaced. New generations normalize what older ones resisted. This is not cynicism, it is demographic reality. History shows that values change faster when cohorts change. The welfare state stabilized as generations grew up within it. Environmental awareness expanded as scientific literacy spread. Digital norms shifted as those born into networks reached adulthood. This does not mean progress is automatic. Generational change can entrench dysfunction as easily as reform. What matters is institutional scaffolding. If institutions adapt alongside values, stability increases. If institutions lag while values shift, polarization intensifies. The present era sits at this intersection. Technological norms have changed faster than governance. Economic structures have globalized faster than political accountability. Cultural expectations have diversified faster than mediation mechanisms. This creates friction. Adaptation will not eliminate friction. It will redistribute it.
The future, therefore, is unlikely to feel calm. Periods of successful adaptation often feel turbulent because systems are actively recalibrating. Conflict is not evidence of failure, it is evidence of renegotiation. History suggests that the absence of conflict is more dangerous than its presence. Rigid stability often precedes collapse. Managed instability precedes renewal. This distinction reframes anxiety. The question is not whether conflict exists. It always does. The question is whether conflict is contained within systems capable of learning. Learning institutions are rare. They are fragile. They require humility. They also require limits on power. Systems that can admit error adapt. Systems that deny error entrench failure. The challenge ahead is institutional learning at scale. This is difficult because success undermines urgency. Once systems stabilize partially, momentum fades. Reform stalls. Old patterns return under new language. History shows that adaptation is not a single phase. It is cyclical. Each generation relearns restraint. Each system retests limits. Each era negotiates balance anew. What comes next, therefore, is not resolution. It is responsibility. Responsibility to maintain adaptability even when crisis fades. Responsibility to resist the temptation of final answers. Responsibility to preserve mediation when conflict subsides. This is not inspiring. It is necessary, and it is how societies endure. Large systems create a convenient illusion. They make individual action feel irrelevant. When power is distributed across markets, technologies, institutions, and global forces, responsibility seems to dissolve. Outcomes feel detached from choice. History appears to move on its own. This perception is understandable. It is also incomplete. History is not shaped by isolated individuals acting alone. It is shaped by accumulated behavior operating within structure. Systems constrain choice, but they do not eliminate it.
They channel it. Agency persists. It simply operates differently at scale. In small societies, agency is visible. A decision by a leader alters the fate of a community. In large societies, agency is diffuse. Decisions compound rather than dominate. Influence accumulates through repetition, not singular acts. This makes responsibility harder to perceive. It also makes it easier to avoid. History repeatedly shows that periods of instability are accompanied by widespread abdication of agency. People wait for leaders, movements, or technologies to resolve contradictions. Participation becomes passive. Moral responsibility is outsourced. This delay matters. Systems adapt fastest when pressure comes from many directions simultaneously. Not all pressure must be dramatic. Much of it is ordinary. Resistance, withdrawal, participation. These behaviors shape incentives. When exploitation is tolerated, it expands. When abuse is normalized, it spreads. When accountability is demanded consistently, it becomes expectation. History's most durable reforms were not driven by constant heroism. They were driven by persistent refusal. Refusal to accept unsafe conditions. Refusal to tolerate corruption. Refusal to remain silent when process breaks. These refusals were rarely unified. They were uneven, often unpopular, sometimes punished. Over time, they accumulated weight. This is the nature of agency at scale. It is not about control. It is about contribution. The danger of the modern era is not powerlessness. It is disconnection. When individuals feel disconnected from outcome, participation declines. Decline reinforces concentration of power. Concentration deepens alienation. The cycle feeds itself. History shows this pattern clearly. Late empires are not characterized by rebellion alone. They are characterized by apathy. Civic participation declines. Local authority weakens. Public goods deteriorate.
Central power responds with enforcement rather than engagement. The system grows louder. Citizens grow quieter. Recovery begins when participation returns, not necessarily enthusiasm, presence. Voting when legitimacy feels fragile. Engaging institutions even when trust is low. Supporting processes rather than personalities. This is not romantic. It is practical. Institutions cannot learn without feedback. Feedback requires participation. Participation requires belief that action matters enough to try. History offers no example of successful renewal driven by withdrawal alone. Withdrawal accelerates collapse. Engagement enables adaptation. This does not mean individuals carry equal responsibility. Power asymmetries are real. Constraints differ. But agency exists at every level. Workers shape labor norms. Consumers shape markets. Citizens shape legitimacy. Professionals shape standards. Educators shape memory. These influences are slow. They are cumulative. They are often invisible in the moment. This invisibility breeds cynicism. Cynicism feels intelligent. It feels protective. It is corrosive. Cynicism convinces individuals that participation is naive. History suggests the opposite. Systems fail fastest when participation collapses. This is why authoritarian systems fear ordinary engagement more than organized opposition. Organized opposition can be crushed. Distributed participation is harder to suppress. The present era often frames agency as performative. Expression replaces action. Visibility replaces impact. History distinguishes between the two. Expression satisfies identity. Action alters incentives. Both matter. Only one changes outcomes. Understanding this clarifies what responsibility looks like now. Not certainty, not purity, not final answers. Responsibility looks like consistency under uncertainty. Showing up when outcomes are unclear. Maintaining standards when enforcement weakens.
Choosing restraint when escalation is rewarded. These actions do not guarantee success. History offers no guarantees. What it offers is pattern recognition. Societies that endure are not those that avoid crisis. They are those that distribute responsibility widely enough to absorb it. The future will not be shaped by a single invention, election, or movement. It will be shaped by millions of small decisions interacting with systems already under strain. This is uncomfortable. It removes the comfort of inevitability. It removes the excuse of helplessness. It restores agency without certainty. History does not move toward resolution. It moves toward continuation. This is difficult to accept because humans prefer endings. Endings imply meaning. They imply that suffering leads somewhere final, that confusion gives way to clarity, that effort produces closure. History offers something less comforting. It offers endurance.
Periods of stability are not rewards. They are pauses. They exist between phases of adjustment, not beyond them. What changes over time is not the presence of uncertainty, but society's tolerance for it. The modern era struggles with this tolerance. Acceleration creates expectation. When systems change rapidly, people assume solutions should arrive just as quickly. When they do not, frustration turns into despair or denial. History suggests this expectation is misplaced. Uncertainty is not transitional. It is structural. Every major adaptation creates new conditions that generate new uncertainties. Agriculture solved scarcity and introduced hierarchy. Industry solved production and introduced inequality. Technology solved distance and introduced fragmentation. Each solution reshaped risk rather than eliminating it. The mistake is expecting permanence.
What comes next is often framed as a destination, a stable future, a resolved society, a corrected system. History shows no evidence that such a state exists. What exists are intervals where systems function well enough to support life, cooperation, and meaning. These intervals are achievements. They are not conclusions. This reframes progress. Progress is not the absence of problems. It is the capacity to manage them without collapse. By this definition, societies succeed not when they eliminate conflict, but when they contain it. Not when they predict the future, but when they remain flexible enough to absorb it. Prediction has always been overrated. Empires collapsed unexpectedly. Technologies produced unintended consequences. Reform succeeded for reasons no one anticipated. History rewards adaptability, not foresight. This matters now because the future is increasingly framed as a threat.
Climate projections, technological disruption, geopolitical instability, demographic change. These are often presented as approaching disasters or breakthroughs. History suggests they are neither. They are pressures. Pressure reveals design flaws.
Pressure forces prioritization. Pressure exposes values made operational. The danger is not pressure itself. The danger is rigidity under pressure. Rigid systems break. Flexible systems bend. Learning systems adjust. The future will not be kind to rigidity, but neither will it reward chaos. The most resilient societies in history were not the most centralized or the most fragmented. They balanced authority with participation, efficiency with restraint, innovation with memory. Memory is essential here. Not memory as nostalgia, memory as instruction. History teaches limits. It shows where power overreaches, where simplification destroys coordination, where certainty precedes catastrophe. It also shows possibility.
It shows that renewal often begins quietly, that trust rebuilds slowly, that meaning emerges through participation, not promise. This is why the present moment feels unresolved. It always is. The expectation that history should make sense in the moment is a modern illusion. People living through earlier transformations felt the same confusion, fear, and exhaustion. They did not know how their era would be remembered. They did not know which decisions mattered most. They did not know whether adaptation would succeed. Neither do we. What history offers is not reassurance. It offers responsibility. Responsibility to maintain systems even when faith is low. Responsibility to resist false clarity. Responsibility to choose restraint when escalation is rewarded. These responsibilities do not guarantee success. Nothing does. But they increase the probability of endurance. And endurance is the real measure of historical success.
What comes next is not a revelation. It is not an answer. It is not a final chapter. It is the continuation of negotiation between power and principle, speed and restraint, freedom and coordination. That negotiation never ends. The question is not whether history will change direction. It always does. The question is whether societies remain capable of changing with it. That capacity is not inherited. It is maintained, quietly, imperfectly, continuously.